Hello, and thank you for joining a webcast today hosted by StoneSoft in conjunction with ICSA Laboratories, where we're going to address the next steps for advanced evasion techniques. I'm joined today by Jack Walsh from ICSA Laboratories, and he's going to provide the ICSA Lab's perspective on advanced evasion techniques and next steps. With that, I'll hand it over to Jack Walsh from ICSA Labs.
Thanks for that introduction, Matt. I'm going to speak briefly to Finnish National CERT's most recent IDS IPS advisory about evasion techniques resulting from the research performed by StoneSoft. Then I'm going to say something about what the advisory means, and I'm going to conclude by suggesting what end users with IPS technology should be doing. So several Finnish CERT advisories have been released about StoneSoft's advanced evasion techniques, or AETs, as they've been nicknamed. Now, all these advisories are intended to aid organizations that employ IPS technology. And having checked these advisories, or having checked the CERT website this morning, I see that the most recent Finnish CERT advisory about the IDS IPS stuff was last updated on December 17, 2010. In that advisory, Finnish CERT mentions how StoneSoft briefed them on 23 different evasion techniques. The advisory then succinctly points out that many different protocols are affected, and among those are the ones listed there on the slide. You can see them mentioned by name. There's MSRPC, SMB, NetBIOS, TCP, and IP were all affected. Finnish National CERT's advisory then goes on to say that they are coordinating the remediation with the affected vendors. And from speaking to Finnish CERT back in October and again this morning before this webcast, I know that they've contacted at least 50 different vendors about this issue. Anyhow, Finnish CERT then tells us in the advisory what the affected vendors have reportedly done, and we'll say more about that on the following slide. And finally, the advisory basically says that that end users should follow their vendor's advice, if there is any. And CERT suggests that end users supplement their protections, and this suggestion is a little bit vague in my mind. But anyway, that's, other than some contact information, that's basically what the advisory says in a nutshell. In terms of vendor information, you see listed there on the slide that StoneSoft and Cisco have provided some information about what their plans are. StoneSoft has said in terms of remediation that for their customers using an IPS version less than, earlier than version 5.0.0, that folks should upgrade to a later version. Cisco says that they're aware of and investigating the issues, but in terms of remediation, Cisco provides no real tangible advice. Now, the reason for the cricket here on the slide is because no other vendors have really indicated anything, and they haven't said anything about how they remediated the issue or what their customers should do. And in my mind, this introduces doubt, as in, maybe your IPS provider has yet to resolve these issues, and/or maybe they aren't making remediation a priority. So, unfortunately, to get to the bottom of what your provider has done, where they are at, the onus then is on you, really, the end user. Perhaps the vendors figure, you're going to be reading their blogs and checking their websites rather than that of Finnish CERT, or before you would check Finnish CERT's website. And so I did that. And after a cursory check, I have seen at least one vendor's blog which said that these evasion techniques are all old news and that their product wasn't affected. Of course, our testing actually reveals the opposite to be true, and this same vendor did have problems with these evasion techniques. So that particular blog entry, at least, is misleading their customers a bit. Another vendor site, and by the way, both of these vendors I'm talking about are not Cisco or StoneSoft, Anyway, this other vendor's site talks about remediation, but they play down the IP and TCP evasions, and right after doing the playing down, they go on to say, or they go on to list some links that take you to where the handful of fixes for the issues are located. So in other words, these vendors have listed some, they're talking about it, but they haven't really given any information yet to CERT. So the point I'm trying to make, I guess, is that for an end user, you're going to need to or want to talk to your IPS provider. Ask them some questions. First, ask if the product now handles the 23 different evasion techniques that were identified. Ask what version you should be running to ensure proper coverage protection from these different evasion techniques. And unfortunately, because there are naysayers out there among the vendor community, you'll have to do some inquisitions to see whether or not your vendor was one of those naysayers. And so, ask if your provider, IPS provider, believes or believed that they already had full protection to begin with. And while many of you may want to ask many other questions, and you certainly should, you definitely need to do that. A final suggested question that I would suggest is whether or not any third-party test labs have confirmed that the evasions were remediated. And if your provider says, that they haven't contacted any labs, then you should expect to hear or them try to sell you on why you don't need to worry about that or why they don't need to contact any third-party labs. So be ready for that. If your provider has supposedly had their IPS tested in this regard by a lab such as ours, then ask for the contact information for that lab's point of contact. And, if it's ICSA Labs and it's network IPS related, then that person would probably be me. So feel free to drop me an email with any questions you might have. My contact information is listed on the cover slide. So that's pretty much it. But this last slide here, I'm just pointing you to some blog entries that I've written about these evasions in case that you want to know more about ICSA Labs' point of view. I mentioned earlier in the presentation that I spoke with Finnish National CERT this morning, and so maybe I could make a couple more final points before I turn it back over to StoneSoft. First, Finnish National CERT has not indicated that all 50 or so vendors have remediated this issue. And perhaps, you would say that's self-evident by just looking at the CERT advisory page and seeing how it names just 2 vendors. But anyway, I think it's still important to point that out. Second is that vendors are primarily responsible for getting in touch with Finnish CERT. I say primarily responsible because Finnish CERT or other CERT organizations do sometimes have to reach back out to the vendors to sort of get them to reply or follow up. But it is primarily the vendor's responsibility to get in touch with Finnish CERT to let them know that the issues are resolved and what their end user customers need to do. The third thing, and finally, I just want to point out that Finnish CERT seems to expect StoneSoft, following some impending conversations between the 2 of them, to begin publicly releasing packet captures and more information about these evasions. And from what Finnish CERT was telling me, that may begin happening later this month, so later in January 2011. And with all that said, now I think I can hand it back over to Matt McKinley at StoneSoft.
Thank you very much, Jack.
Sure. Oh, I guess I have to turn it over to you actually, don't I? Okay, sorry about that. Here we go.
No problem. Okay, thank you very much, Jack. Just very quickly, my name is Matt McKinley, and I'm the Director of Product Management here in the U.S. And so I'm just going to share a little bit about what's next. So we've talked about advanced evasion techniques. I'm going to have a quick review of what they are, and then we're going to talk about some next steps that you can follow. Some of this information really echoes some of what Jack just talked about. So, but I have some other things that we can focus on. So just a quick review here. An advanced evasion technique is a way of evading an IPS, which by itself, evading an IPS is not new, but really what's new is that there are some novel methods that are combined with some existing methods that really do make it an advanced evasion technique, a novel way to get around an IPS in a more stealthy fashion. Now, ICSA Laboratories, their involvement has really been instrumental in this whole thing because they've really helped us validate this, because we discovered this in our laboratories, but it always helps to have good third-party validation, and that's where ICSA has been very instrumental, and they've also been very good at providing education. You saw some of the blog posts referenced in Jack's last slide, and that is some very good information that I highly recommend reading. Now, AETs, I think there have been a lot of questions about how this translates into a real-world threat. You know, what should make me concerned as a customer? Well, IPS over the last several years has been much lauded as a virtual patch. And basically what that means is that you've got this device at the very beginning of your network that has all of these fingerprints that can recognize attacks. So it allows you to deploy fingerprints for these attacks at the, say, at the perimeter of the network, for example. And it's really allowed people to sort of forego a good patching regimen. So that provides a bit of a danger, because if you have a way to completely bypass an IPS in an undetectable way, then virtual patching is really at that point rendered ineffective. The last thing I want to talk about is the normalization being the key ingredient of why AETs work as well as they do. Normalization, and I'm going to talk about this more in just a minute. Normalization is really what's at the heart of this whole thing. So these are just these are just 4 points to sort of bring everybody up to speed on what what's going on with AETs. And so I'm going to address these in more details coming up.